Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Michelle Ekstrom, and I'm the Group Director in the Education Program at the National Conference of State Legislatures. You are joining us for our virtual meeting series, and today we're going to be focusing on the pandemic learning loss and approaches to summer learning. So before we get started, I just wanted to remind you of some protocol we have for each of our virtual meetings. We ask that you please join us by video rather than just by phone, because we want to see your face and we want you to participate as if you're in a live meeting with us. We would also ask that you please add your full name to your tile, and you can do that by clicking in the three dots in the upper right-hand corner of your tile. If you'd please indicate your full name and the state that you're from or the organization that you're representing. This just helps us to know who's on the virtual meeting for security purposes and so that we can keep track of who's joining us. We would also ask that you please mute your lines as long as you aren't being asked to speak. So if you can just keep yourself muted, there might be times when we ask you to open up your line and ask a question that way, or you can certainly type your questions in the chat box as well. You can also raise your hand, and you will be recognized also by today's moderator. Please don't share your screen under any circumstances. And also just a reminder that this meeting will be recorded. We are archiving all of our meetings for your reference, both on NCSL's YouTube channel and also on our website. And the link is listed there at the bottom. And we will also be sure to post the slides and any additional resources that we think might be helpful as well. Today, we are going to be joined by Ashley Wallace. She oversees our work on this issue area. So I am going to turn it over to Ashley, and she is going to review the meeting agenda for you and also introduce our speakers. Ashley?
Great, thanks, Michelle. As Michelle said, I'm Ashley Wallace. And as you guys know, summer learning loss happens every summer, but due to COVID-19, it's expected to be compounded, both social emotional learning loss as well as academic learning loss. So that's what we're here to talk about today. We're going to start our meeting with two speakers from NWEA. First, we'll have Aaliyah Samuel and then Beth Tarasawa, and they'll share their findings around COVID learning loss and outline some policy implications. Then we're going to have an audience poll and then a chance to ask some questions of NWEA. Our next featured speaker is Terry Peterson. He's an education expert specializing in after-school and summer learning policy. And he's going to talk about the after-school and summer learning supports, both during the summer and with fall reentry. Then we'll have a chance to do some, respond to a question in chat box, and then a chance for some questions for Terry. And then Michelle's going to wrap up the meeting with an overview of upcoming virtual meetings. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce both of our speakers from NWEA. First, we have Aaliyah Samuel, and she is a fellow at the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard and is the Executive Vice President of Government Affairs and Partnerships at NWEA. Next, you'll hear from Dr. Beth Tarasawa. She is Executive Vice President of Research at NWEA. Now I'm going to just turn it over to Dr. Samuel, who will share her screen, so it might take a moment here.
Yes, it's saying that it's disabled, so let's see if it resets. Yep, still no.
Is it still not letting you?
Nope, it says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Oh, that's odd. Why don't you go ahead and get started, and I'll see if I can get it pulled up for you.
Okay. And I sent you a PDF of the slides. I'm not sure if that helps. So good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. We've had the opportunity to share our learning loss work and some of the policy recommendations, both at the federal level, but also at the state level as well. One of the things I would like to just level set is and give you a little bit of background on NWEA. A lot of people aren't aware of just the depth and the footprint that we have. We are in over 9,300 schools here in the US, and we assess just over 11.5 million kids just in the United States. We are also in 146 countries and service about another 500,000 kids internationally as well. And one of the pieces, in addition to our footprint, is NWEA has a really deep research footprint. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Beth, who can go into a little bit more detail on the background of the research, as well as some of her findings, and then we'll go into some of the policy recommendations.
Great. I'm trying to share. It looks like we have permissions now. Are folks able to see that now? Okay, great. I'm going to just kind of kick off from where Dr. Samuel left off. So thank you for the time today. We're really thrilled to share some of our preliminary research with you all. And as Aaliyah has mentioned, we take our not-for-profit status really seriously. And I say that also coming from the research end, that it means not only are we reinvesting our fiscal resources in really strategic ways, but we're also reinvesting our data to answer persistent problems in the field of education. And so while we know COVID-19 is, is very different than summer learning loss and what happens in kind of normal conditions of summer, it may provide some idea of what we might see when we return in the fall. And that was the origin of the work that we're leveraging, not only really good and really robust data, but also the expertise of most notably Megan Kufeld, my colleague, who is an expert in the space of seasonal learning. And so at NWEA, we've been partnering for many years with kind of the usual suspects, the Sean Reardon, the Andrew Hose, but also Doug Downey at Ohio State, who's been doing some work in the area of summer learning loss. And so what we're showing you today, right, is looking at real data. So this represents a data set of over 5 million kids who took our map growth assessment in the year between 2017 and 2018. So the solid line represents actual real data of 5 million kids, the first slide here being in reading for grades 3 through 8. And so we contrasted two hypotheticals. So one was what we call the COVID slowdown, which is represented by the dashed line there, in which kids more or less returned in the fall with about the same level of achievement they would when they left. For simplicity purposes, we did March 15th, when most of the schools in the country started to shut down brick and mortar. We did a second hypothesis, which was the COVID slide hypothesis. And so here we walked back the real observed trajectory that we see in summer learning loss. So you'll notice the slope is the same, and walk that back to the date of March 15th to get some idea of what we might see for potential losses. And so under this scenario, we would expect kids to come back in the fall with about 70% of the typical learning gains that we would see in reading. And then for math, these forecasts were a bit bleaker. So here we have solid lines representing real data, the dashed line being the slowdown scenario, and then the dotted line being the COVID slide scenario, where we're walking back that slope to March 15th. And you'll notice in math, it's a bit more of a dramatic slope, both on the increase as well as the summer month slide. And so here you're not only seeing the summer loss, but you're actually also losing some critical months of instruction those last few months of school potentially. And so when we walk this back, our COVID slide estimates for math, kids would return in the fall with about 50% of the typical learning gains they'd see under normal scenarios, and in some grades almost a full year behind. And we give a lot of caveats and disclaimers of this data. We know COVID could be very different than what we've seen in the summer, but there's a few areas just for your purposes that we give some credibility to the work. So one, we don't just look at the seasonal learning patterns, we also look at things like absenteeism and inclement weather closures. So like Hurricane Katrina and what we learned from lessons there in Doug Harris's group out of Tulane, which also talks about the long game, right? That a lot of these losses may take a couple years to recoup. But we also see similar patterns, not only across these different types of closure, but also different data sets. So equals K, Nate, that we see more dramatic losses typically in math than we do in reading, and they tend to impact the younger grades a bit more than we see in the older grades. So because of that, and we're seeing similar patterns in our data, we had a little more optimism about the strength of these predictions heading into the fall. We'll also note that we really don't know how the variation might play out. And so the last slide that I'll share with you from the research point of view is also looking at this may impact things very differently depending on socioeconomic background of families, on access to resources, on one-to-one devices, on how well schools switch to remote instruction in meaningful ways, collect attendance, and the like. And so because of that, one of the things that we keep talking about when we're meeting with big districts is the vast variation that teachers may experience come fall. Aaliyah, if you can advance to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. That, we know by socioeconomic background, by racial group potentially, by gender, by achievement status, that we could see greater variation when kids return. And so in other words, teachers always contend with different achievement levels at the start of their school year. But COVID could play out really differently in those summer months or those 6 months out of school. Some families may accelerate learning. Some kids may actually have better gains than you would see under normal circumstances. But we would hypothesize that's probably not the majority of our kids. And we also know, given the socioeconomic, given the socio-emotional trauma associated with those patterns, that we could see our most historically marginalized populations impacted more severely. So what that means for problem of practice is teachers return with really disparate learning levels this next year. So I'll pause there. I'm happy to take questions when Aaliyah's done with some of our policy recommendations and considerations. But one of the things when we just talk about from a research point of view is the importance of really good data to be able to understand not only what has happened, but also recovery, and to process and track recovery efforts. And also to think about how this is really a call to action, if you will, and similarly to the epidemiologists and the flattening the curve, if we could similarly flatten the slope or reduce the slope in education. So there's really this push to figure out how we can lock arms with our educators at a school time, considerations, what we can do in these summer months to really provide the social emotional support that teachers need and students need, but also the academic supports they'll likely need.
Thanks, Beth. So what I'd like to do now is just share some of our policy recommendations that we have been sharing, not only at the state level, but also with many of our districts and superintendents. We know that right now educators are grappling with what is the right decision as we prepare to go back to school. And one of the things we know is we have to really think about how to make up lost instructional time. And really, this is all over the place. There are some districts, like my children's district, we had a 5-week gap before we started virtual school. And virtual school is essentially 2 hours a day, where in some states they have had virtual school 2 weeks right after the pandemic hit, and kids could be in school 3 to 4 hours a day. So it really, there's such a wide range. But at the core of it, we really have to think about what instructional time looks like for kids, and not just with any teacher. We know high quality teachers are going to be most important as we go back to school. And I say that as a former educator. I was an elementary teacher, assistant principal, and principal. And so recognizing the spectrum of the quality of our teachers and also their experience and content knowledge, thinking about the right classroom placement, thinking about what teachers should be in front of what groups of kids to ensure that they're getting that quality instructional time. The second is really thinking about what the restart of school should look like. The reality of it is this year, it cannot be a traditional back to school fall start. And really we're seeing 3 kind of frames in which districts and states are thinking about the return to school process. 1 being a virtual start, 2 being a hybrid mix of virtual and potentially going back to the building on block scheduling or split schedules. And then 3, what a full return to the brick and mortar structure of school will look like. This is fast changing. Just over the weekend, there was a state chief who announced that as the CDC guidelines for what reopening schools look like came out, they we're now rethinking about a virtual start because of the sheer cost of cleaning supplies, the plexiglass that would be needed in school offices and in the classrooms, and the cost for installation, that it really superseded the budgets that districts and states have right now. And so it's really interesting to see the trends as more information comes out, both from the health side, but also the education and funding side. The other piece is really thinking about what outside of the classroom learning is going to look like, and how do we surround kids with environments or how do we surround kids with supports that will help them while they're outside of the formal classroom setting. And the fourth one really ties into that, is thinking about what a blended learning option is, because there is a high probability that we'll have another period of disruption in the upcoming school year. So how can we begin to strategically plan and have those blended learning options in place, so when and if a disruption occurs, there's already some continuity or consistency, or even an understanding of how school can continue to operate. So these are just some recommendations at the state level. We have also been working very diligently at the federal level, not only providing congressional hearings on learning loss, and also providing them feedback as to what we think could support states and districts in this next stimulus bill. But we've also been working closely with the U.S. Department of Education and providing them feedback as well. And there's a couple of things that we really believe are important. Is one, to think about what a substantial, and B, flexible investment in education could be for both state and local education agencies. We know different states have been hit in different ways, and giving states not only the funds they need to stabilize their education system, but also the flexibility that they're going to need in order to make the educational decisions. The second is thinking about the accountability infrastructure. We have been asked time and time again, what do you think? Should we have waivers for spring 21 testing? What should happen with the consequences that come with the accountability system? And one of the things we really believe in, as an assessment provider, but also because we really try to use research to inform policy and practice, is to, yes, keep that accountability infrastructure in place and allow students to be, granted, this is with us being in school, whether it's virtual or site-based, to still be assessed so that we can get the data and really understand where this COVID class is, but not to use the data for some of the consequences that come with the accountability system, like school grading. That is really the last thing that states and schools and districts need right now. But we would be able to really get good data as far as looking at growth models over time and tracking students based off of the information we could obtain. Also thinking about the Department of Education and ensuring that they have the right funds allocated to make sure that service providers can be positioned and in place to support schools when they go back. We know that there are going to be needs on the social emotional learning side for both educators and students. We know that assessment this is really an opportunity for educators to use assessment to drive their instruction and meet the gaps of the students. I like to use the analogy, even with my own son, that he'll go back to school like a block of Swiss cheese. As parents, we've done the best that we can to give him some of the concepts, but there will be gaps in his knowledge. And how can a teacher quickly assess him to be able to know where those gaps are and begin to intentionally fill those concept gaps? And then also, just from an equity perspective, making sure that we expand and secure the connectivity for future digital learning needs, but also the technology that's in place. A lot of districts, due to availability of their technology, have only been able to provide one laptop per family. And I have 2 kids in my home. We're blessed to have personal computers so we could put each child on a computer. But what happens to families that have multiple children who have to be on at the same time or similar time windows? How can we make sure that they not only have the technology needs, but also the connectivity as well? And so we've been advocating for an increased investment there as well. So holistically, we really are trying to get our research out there, and from a policy and advocacy perspective, use our research to drive the policy decisions and recommendations that we know will really support not just students, but educators and families as they return back to school and whatever that might look like. So I'm going to pause there and turn it over for questions.
I see a question in the chat box from Representative Dabney. Will NWEA be reporting on actual learning loss in the fall when they start getting real assessment data, assuming kids go back to school in the fall? And second part of his question is NWEA looking at making their tests available remotely as AP and ACT is reportedly a particular concern if this fall is also interrupted?
Yes, so I can take one of those questions and then I'll lob it over to my colleague Beth. So on the remote testing piece, yes, we are moving to a remote proctoring system or feature so that kids can be assessed remotely. That system right now is not live because we have been discouraging states and districts to do assessment of kids right now, but that system will be live end of July because we do recognize that there are some states that are already talking about a virtual early start to school and using that to supplement whatever in-person instruction that will come later down the line. And so we wanted to make sure that we have it up and available for any schools or districts that opt to start school early from a virtual perspective to meet the needs of their students. And then Beth, the second part.
Yeah, I can add a little bit about the contextualization and the using a map data come fall, wherever that may be taking place. So we're partnering with the Center for Reinventing Public Education as well, who is documenting different policies related to COVID. So when schools went remote, one-to-one device information to try to get some idea of what's happening in these last few months. We're also planning to leverage the data that we do get in fall relatively quickly to think about magnitude and also by different types of students. Are we seeing greater impacts for certain segments of the population more than others? So we definitely will be, all eyes are on that fall data, and we have a number of people that are interested in looking at how kids are recovering. And it will also be, I think, really informative to think about how do we plan for the future. So we're grappling right now as an organization we have current partners who've been using us before. So how can we leverage prior information about those students on kind of how they've performed typically relative to their prior performance. We also have information on national norms. So thinking about how kids are performing relative to kind of a national average or different benchmarks for college readiness, for instance. So where are kids relative to those aspirational goals? And then I think the real crystal ball question is how much did this impact? And are we seeing similar patterns like we do in seasonal learning or absenteeism that we'll see here in COVID? Or does it play out really differently by different subpopulations? So yeah, all signs, and people are very, very interested in that data from both the practitioner, kids, and families who really need that data to understand the Swiss cheese, as Aaliyah mentioned before, but also the real impact on learning and how do we catch those kids up that they don't become systematically behind in a really cohesive way.
See another question from Clark County, Nevada. How will this affect our K-8 map testing?
So I am not sure where the discussions are county by county, but I would be happy to connect with our director, one of our directors who oversees Clark County specifically, so that we can provide very specific information as to where Clark County is with their map assessment. So I'm happy to, I think that was Marilyn, get the right person to you for the right update. I primarily work at the state and district and federal level.
Yeah, I can chime in here just a little bit because we've been working pretty intimately with Dr. Jara, who's your superintendent out there, as you know, and MAP is a big part of their assessment system, but also working with the Khan Academy Accelerator. There's a pilot there to think about that math slide and interventions. So there's a lot of activity in Clark. I know they're still trying to figure out the restart plan, but Dr. Jara is definitely leading the way. It's been interesting working with him too, partly because of his history down in Southern Florida. So he has been very much up on the front lines of hurricane season, where kids are in and out of school, and has talked about those. So I kind of silver lining is that I think there's a lot of forward thinking in that particular county and preparation, moving kind of from out of the trenches and triage mode of getting one-to-one devices and getting lunches and food to kids, to now thinking about really restarting. How do you leverage professional learning to scale virtually and otherwise? So as Aaliyah had mentioned, we'll connect you with the folks from the district side. But Clark is definitely been thinking about this earlier than a lot of places.
Great. Thank you both. And I encourage you all to keep typing in your questions along with what state you're from, as we'll have another chance to ask some questions later on. I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, who's going to do a quick audience poll.
Yeah, so we have some questions for you related to the discussion that we just had. The first is, have you been given an estimate for learning loss for students in your state? Yes or no? The second question is, have you been briefed, or are you aware of your state's plan to determine the amount of learning loss? So we're going to leave that open for just a few more seconds, and then we'll end the polling. This is a really great way for us to get a sense of your engagement in the conversations that are going on in your state. And it looks like no one has been given an estimate in their state. I know that I did hear from a legislator from Indiana. It has been a topic of discussion with their superintendent. But I think for the most part, legislators are not being briefed on this, at least at this point. Maybe if and when you go back into session, that will be a discussion that you have. So as a result, we would really encourage you to engage in that conversation, start up that conversation with your Secretary of Education or Commissioner of Education or the staff of the state agency. Okay.
Michelle, could I just chime in? I really just want to pull in, really one of the things that prior to this role at NWEA, I worked for the National Governors Association, leading their education division, and worked very closely with governors' offices. And I think my plea to all of you on the line would really be to consider, to Michelle's point, what the learning loss might look like in your state, and then also recognizing that every state has been hit a little differently with COVID. And what does that mean for your student community, your teacher community, and your parent community? And really, I think this is an opportunity to think about what policies either need to be pulled back or put in place to support what our new normal is, because the reality of it is education, how we knew it growing up, will likely no longer exist. And so as we think about back to school, really having a broader vision of what education could look like and should look like. And it's an opportunity to really put into place some of the practices that I know many educators and advocates and parents have been really wanting to get integrated into the school system. So I would just love to charge you with thinking about evaluating the system as a whole, but also thinking past beyond the fall, because really this is a longer run game and not a short run game. So, and policy absolutely changes people's lives. I actually left my principalship to get into policy because that year, it was actually in the midst of the last recession. I was a principal in Arizona, and I felt like I was being bludgeoned by both federal policy and state policy at the same time. And so it was that reality of trying to implement policies at my school site that really was the catalyst for me coming into this policy world. And so as a pure educator in the policy space, I would just like to give you that charge to think about the future of education and the needs of your state, and really now's the time to be creative and put those structures in place.
Great points, thanks. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Terry Peterson is an education consultant to the C.S. Mott Foundation and a senior fellow at the Riley Institute at Furman University. He co-chairs the After School Alliance and chairs the White Riley Peterson Leadership Initiative. If you give us just a moment, we'll pull up his slides.
All right, here we go.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And I want to thank everyone for being on this webinar. I know state legislatures have so many big issues to deal with right now. And this is actually them. How can we help students catch up and keep up from the learning that my colleagues so brilliantly just described? And a second related issue is equally important, but very different, but these come together, and that is, where can children and youth go and thrive so their parents can work and help with the economic recovery and put enough hours in to make a living? So what we're finding is that expanding the availability of quality summer and after school opportunities across the state can really make a difference on both dealing with the learning loss and helping families get back to the economic table. And funding and regulations are very, very important. So in my presentation, I'm going to focus on two things. One is, what is the evidence and what do we know about summer and after school opportunities to make a positive difference? And also, at the very end, I'm going to give you 5 options that your state might want to consider. If you could change the slide next. Let's start out first with summers. Summer opportunities are very important. A very important committee at the National Academies of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine recently examined the whole summertime experience and what happens and what could happen and what doesn't happen. And they came up with 4 domains of well-being that can be perhaps enhanced or reduced in the summers: academic learning, social emotional development, physical and mental health, and safety. Next slide. And these conclusions that they made were pretty recent, but they were before the COVID-19 crisis. But they're especially relevant now in dealing with the recovery. And what they is basically, summers offer a time for families and public and private organizations to close the gap in development and learning, and to ensure that all youth have access to experiences and settings that support their needs, including nutrition and safety. But what you just heard, there's tremendous variation in families and in neighborhoods in these opportunities. So we need to think about how can we enhance and have more of these opportunities, particularly in places that really need them. Next slide. So, as I said, the conclusions from the Academy could not be more timely in dealing with the summer learning strategies that are needed now for the recovery, learning recovery, but also probably in economic recovery. But what do we know about after school opportunities and how they also can make a contribution? Next slide. The people working in the after school field sometimes use this phraseology. Unsupervised time in after school is sometimes called a time of risk for some children and youth, particularly older youth. A study some years back by Fight Crime, Invest in Kids called this prime time for youth crime. Now, this becomes really relevant when you start thinking out into the fall. If schools go to split schedules in the fall, either every other day or afternoon and mornings, the prime time could be doubled. So instead of having 3 hours of unoccupied time after school, turn it into 6. Instead of having perhaps an hour before school starts, we could be having 5 or 6. Well, students or family are waiting for the second shift. What do the children do then? What do the families do then? Next slide, please. Kind of summarizing a great deal of research over the last few years in particular, we found that if well organized and delivered, there after-school programs can really be a time for inspiration and help students succeed. This is a rough list here of some of the areas. If the programs focus on these areas, not all of them focus on all, and if they're done well, they have been found to be related to improved grades and work habits, more self-control and confidence gains, improved school day attendance and behavior, and less risky behavior outside in the community related to tobacco, marijuana, and alcohol use. Next slide. I'm going to give you a little quick preview of a couple major studies just to show you where they're coming from, and you may at some time want to look them up. This one is a meta-analysis, which is sort of a study of studies, about 60 studies by Durlach and Weisberg. And they found in quality programs, there were percentile gains in these 5 key areas: attendance, social behaviors, reduction in problem behavior, school grades, and test scores. And they're kind of lumped together under the acronym of ABC, attendance, behavior, coursework improvements. Next slide. Another way to look at the impact after school is to look out over time. Dr. Deborah Vandell has done a great deal of work in this area and is working on it as we speak. And she found that high participation in after-school activities, quality programs, can help narrow the achievement gap in math up through grade 5. Since she did this study, she's now followed some students into 15 years of age and into their 20s. And she finds quality program participation leads to better results. Next slide. Oh, let me deviate for a minute from the slides because I know our colleagues found particularly disturbing possible losses in math. Actually, the research I've seen in after school and summers, that may be the area where you can make a difference in 1 year of summer programming, if it's quality, and 1 year of after school program. Reading tends to take a little more, almost 2 summers and probably a double dose of after school. In the summer research field, if you're interested in recent research, the Wallace Foundation has looked at a whole set of summer programs and found that quality programs that encourage attendance, high attendance, result in gains first in math and the second year in reading and math. Let me mention something about high attendance. And I think our earlier speakers were alluding to this around the Swiss cheese. Not only do you have to fill in the Swiss cheese, but young people have to want to come to these programs. They have to be interesting and engaging, or they'll walk. And the older they are, the quicker they'll walk. So you can't just sit them down and give them more drill and kill and tell them to learn more. It has to be interesting, engaging, which according to the research on the science and learning, that actually sticks. Kids actually remember it more. And these quality programs tend to have these types of principles, either in after school or summers. They tend to use a mix of staff, of community people who often the students know, and teachers and volunteers from local organizations. They are the good programs really stress engagement, engaging instruction in literacy and math, in STEM and STEAM by enthusiastic teachers. They also include enrichment experiences, often with community partners, such as in the arts and sports and coding and robotics, and for older youth, career internships. And finally, this was also mentioned earlier, they tend to use more blended approaches to developing young people, deploying hands-on projects, incorporating social emotional learning, arts integration, family involvement, and wellness. When you do all these things together, young people want to attend, they want to participate, and you get much better results. There's several resources, well, there's many resources, but 2 national groups that are good if you're interested in this topic to look at are the National Association of Summer Learning and the After School Alliance. And they can also provide you with some more tailored guidance and support if you'd like that. Next slide. So just in summary, the after school and summer programs today's kind of modern programs really are built engaged partnerships across a whole spectrum of experiences and across a whole set of age groups. And they tend to have these ingredients that I mentioned earlier. And when you have these ingredients, you tend to get better results and young people want to participate. Next slide. Now, what does state government do about this? There are many possibilities. I'm going to lay out 5 for you, and I would hope that you would think of them and others like them, because I think, as was said, what was the wording here? We need to surround outside the classroom, and this is one good way to do it. And we need to use learning, and as I described, quality programs do that. So what are the 5 possibilities that you might in your state consider to help expand after school opportunities? Next slide. First one, think about changes in your state laws or regulations to foster greater collaboration among school and community-based organizations. I'm going to use the initial CBOs. I normally hate initials, but community-based organization takes a lot of room up on a slide, so I'm going to use it reluctantly. What kind of law changes, regulation would invite and encourage more school community-based organization collaboration? Here's some key areas. We know from the virus that there's great differences in access to technology and connectivity. Community-based groups, along with schools and after-school and summer program, can help increase that access and connectivity. We might have a massive need for more facility space. Think about it. If we go to half as many students per class, where are the students going to go? And where are the after-school and summer programs, particularly after-school and before-school programs? Where are they going to be held? There may be no room in schools. What are other facilities in the neighborhood of schools that could be used for after-school and summer programs, and maybe even some of the school programs? This will entail us really to look at serious partnerships. And the final point is that often community-based organizations and in summer and after-school programs are better connected to community mentors, health and mental health providers, enrichment opportunities, social emotional learning, and these combination of supports that was mentioned earlier that are so important sometimes are easier to pull off in after school and summers. They're not always there, and schools should try to do it too, but if they're on a tight schedule, as I think it's going to happen in the fall, we're really going to need these after school and summer opportunities with CBOs involved. Next slide. Another option is to allocate a portion of a state's CARES K-12 federal monies for summer and after school opportunities. Just for your consideration, I did a little simulation, kind of took a typical state, typical number. Historically, a typical summer or after school program would cost perhaps $100,000 to $200,000 per school or school community site. The variation comes from the cost of living and kind of the nature of the programs. Clearly, the site costs will be somewhat higher now in order to meet all the health provisions and distancing, and the need to use more virtual and learning combined with in-person activity. So I upped the cost a little to show you what you could do. So in a typical state, if you invest $35 to $45 million of CARES K-12 funding, this would provide roughly 100 new summer sites and 100 new after-school sites, which would be tremendous in a state. And yet it would only take 15 to 20% of that state's K-12 CARES monies. So that's a second option. Next slide. Third option is to think about the CARES higher education money to support more work, study, and interns for summers and after-school programs. As we said, to allow for more distancing and also keep the costs affordable in summers and after school, it's worth considering how could you use some of the CARES higher education monies to support a big growth in work, study, and or interns from 2- and 4-year colleges, and also we're going to have, and people are seeing it already, huge numbers of unemployed graduates. How could we use perhaps these monies to re-engage them or engage them in summer and after-school programs on perhaps master teachers and senior staff with proper training and screening, and those teaching assistants, the interns, the work-study people, could perhaps be working at a reduced salary in exchange for college work and service credit. I know every state's going to be really having a tight budget crunch, so we need to think of some new ways to both deliver services and, in this kind of situation, almost double dip. Give young college students and graduate experiences, and yet have them help with summer and after-school programs. Next slide. The next option is also a state CARES funding stream, and many of you in education may not be aware of this. It's the CARES Child Care Monies. This program has a long title, and it's Child Development Block Grant. It's CCDBG. Often used the initials, most people don't know what it stands for. It's the child care. This block grant normally has a lot of requirements. In the CARES Act, the monies do not require matching funds from the states, and they can be used in a variety of ways without waivers. So this is important. As I understand it, Utah is cleverly using about 11 million of their CARES CCDBG monies to provide summer opportunities across their state. This is really clever use of their monies, and yet it's only to about 20% of their child care funds. The rationale I thought was terrific, and one of the publications I saw, parents need safe summer programs for school-age children so they can and reduce summer and spring learning losses. Next slide. This one, regardless of federal money or not, I think it's very important, particularly in this crisis, to think of ways you could refine language in your school funding system, categorical funding, financing laws, whatever might be appropriate, and find ways to create financial incentives, state financial incentives, to offer through school CBO collaboration more quality summer and after school opportunities, especially for struggling students and in high need schools. We're going to need this not just this year, as was said, but several years. We're really going to, I think, have a staggering loss in many ways for young people, and states should think of ways in their own funding scheme how to do this. I stress again the school CBO collaboration, and because of my research, the cost of offering high quality summer and after school program with schools and CBOs working together, from youth groups to community groups to cultural groups to college groups, the costs tend to be much lower than other ways of providing after school and summer programs. Also in the statute, you might consider some of the components I mentioned earlier, because there's a tendency to think you can just throw together a summer program, throw out a ball, let kids run around, put them behind a desk and give them worksheets. That's not going to work. They need to have activity and fun activities, but they need to be well thought out and blended, as was discussed. Next slide. Let me wrap up with this last slide. I talk a lot around the country about school reform at all levels and how after school and summer fit in. And sometimes people say, you know, you're just saying after school and summers are the silver bullet. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that after school and summer learning are the silver bullets. We must have quality schools with staff, great curriculum, and with NWEA, great assessments. But we also need these additional after school and summer learning opportunities. And so it is increasingly, in my estimation, that they may in fact be a silver lining, an important strategy, a piece of the education puzzle, and especially now for the COVID-19 recovery. I'm happy to take any questions or disagreements. it's a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you everyone for being on this webinar.
Thanks, Terry. Just as you feel free to start typing your questions in the chat box, and as you're doing that, Michelle's going to bring up our next slide. We have a chat box question for you as well. So here's a question for you, and you could just put in the chat box your state and answer these questions. Do you think that there's a role for CBOs, like after school summer programs, to play in the recovery from learning loss in the fall learning re-engagement? And if so, how do you see that role? Give you some time to put those in. I see from Representatives Tomiko Santos, Washington State, CBOs will be essential to ensuring that students in schools are able to function well and safely. Pierce McNair of South Carolina says, I believe there's a role, but given uncertainty with K-12 programs, I'm not sure how the two would integrate, especially with such little time before summer. Folks are welcome to continue sharing in the chat box. Also, another opportunity to ask questions of Dr. Terry Peterson or either of our NWEA speakers. I see from Dwayne Johnson, how do states provide services to parents that have children who have aged out of the traditional child care providers and are unable to safely remain home alone without supervision once the daily educational instruction concludes, whether in person or done remotely? Terry, do you have?
Yeah, let me tackle the last one. The last question, that's pretty much a requirement that the federal care money goes to a certain age, but many schools and CBOs offer after school and summer opportunities for middle and high school students. They may call them after school in high school, but they find ways to provide opportunities through either local funding or local funding on a sliding fee scale, maybe working with local city or county government or parks and recreation, or maybe even faith-based groups but it's very, the growing area that I've seen for after schools is actually in middle and early high school. I think for exactly the reason that was cited. Those are the young people can really get off track in those hours, and finding some new clever ways, CBOs and schools or community colleges or cultural arts groups is really important. Referring back to an earlier question about summer learning, and I think I'd be interested my colleagues think about, with this huge loss of time, it's not just academics, it's social learning. How do you work in a team? Why do you even school? I've seen a very successful program that uses arts through science, technology, engineering in some rural schools for 3rd through 8th grade. And this past year at one of the schools, the principal said they saw no learning loss over the summer with their MAP test, and students came back excited and felt better equipped to work in a new school year. So I think there's the summer programs and after school, they can be all about reading and math, but they can't be narrowly focused on narrow drill and kill. You won't get any results that way, in my estimation. I haven't seen it, by the way. You can get very good results. You can incorporate all those skills, but you needed to do it in a way that's interesting to young people through projects and in using arts and sports and robotics, and those types of opportunities can be put together in fairly short time if you have people with expertise in those areas.
Great. And one last question from Lisa Callan of Washington State. I would like to hear examples of how CBOs and districts have partnered to reduce loss.
Well, I can give you a couple, and maybe my colleagues too can do some. This one is very in Baltimore. A couple ago, the Baltimore City Schools, unbeknownst to various, some are straight on academic providers, some use arts integration, some use different approaches. They evaluated the results of all the different vendors. And the program that got the best results in improved reading and math performance and attendance was a program that used the arts to teach reading and math. And then they had arts opportunities before and after the math and reading lessons. So the CBO was actually an arts organization working hand in glove with the teachers. They worked together. In this case, they got better results in reading and math, but they also, the kids were excited about school and learning. And they've been so successful, the district has asked them to take over almost all their summer reading programs in Baltimore. There's other examples, like I mentioned, other STEAM example, robotics clubs, coding, where CBOs can come in and work with young people. It tends to work best when you have the youth group or community group paired with a teacher, and they work together to offer exciting instruction that's engaging, but also has the excitement of a outside group and person involved.
Great, thank you, Terry. And I'll turn it over to Michelle, who's got a listing of our upcoming meetings.
Thank you to all of our speakers today. That was a really fascinating discussion and something that's very much top of mind, I know, for many legislators going into this school year. I'm trying to figure out how to assess the amount of learning loss and if there's anything that we can be doing between now and then to try to mitigate that learning loss. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us. Just a reminder of the upcoming COVID-19 virtual meetings that we have. We are going to continue this virtual meeting series through the end of June, and we will continue to provide an opportunity every Tuesday and Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and you'll continue to receive those updates from me. This Friday, we're going to focus on legislative tracking and what's been happening in the legislative sessions. We know that some states have been plowing through and trying to address what they can via legislation. And other states are now moving into special sessions, or we are beginning to meet again. So we're going to get a quick update on the legislative tracking and what we see is going on. On Tuesday, we had a great opportunity to hear from international education experts at the National Center for Education and Economy, who of course are our partners in our international study group work, about what is going on around the world. What are other countries' approaches to education right now? What are the lessons they've learned, and how has the structure of their education system allowed them to perhaps adapt in a way that we haven't, or getting in the way of delivering the instruction that they need? And then we're going to shift to a discussion with local school district leaders to give them an opportunity to tell you what, from their perspective, has happened on the ground, is happening this summer, and what they might need from you as legislators to support them. And we're going to shift the following week to a discussion around teaching. We're going to focus at first on recruitment and preparation, and then to supports for classroom teachers. And then on Friday, I'm sorry, that should say Friday, that should say Tuesday, June 16th instead of Friday, May 29th. We're going to have guidance for reopening schools in the fall. Randy Weingarten from EFT will be joining us along with the CDC to let you know what the guidance is and the conversations that they've been having with states and districts about reopening. We're going to also have a discussion about early learning, and then we're going to end with a discussion about the state revenue forecast. I'm sure we'll know a whole lot more about state revenue forecasts at that point, and we'll have a good sense of where the education budgets are in the states. And then finally, we're going to end with a discussion about evidence-based policymaking. We have a new center at NCSL that's launching in June, and our director of that center will be talking with you about how this is more important than ever to really be thinking about evidence-based policymaking when you're making these tough decisions about budgets and how we should approach this crisis. What is it that we can be doing to ensure that the policies that we're considering have a strong evidence base? Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you'll join us for these upcoming meetings. We'll continue to update you on all of them, and have a good rest of the week, everyone.
Bye.